In a courtyard somewhere in Urbino in the last years of the 15th century, a boy of perhaps 11 or 12 was watching his master arrange a group of figures across a long panel. The light was falling in through high windows in a way that made the workshop feel like the inside of a shell, pale and clean and suspended. The boy's name was Raffaello Sanzio, though no one called him that yet in the way the world would later say it, like the name of something already finished, already perfect. He was just the painter's son, apprentice now to Pietro Perugino, who was among the most sought-after painters in central Italy, whose figures moved with a sweetness that made every panel feel like a song being sung very quietly. The boy was mixing colors, or perhaps preparing a section of wall, or watching the way Perugino's brush moved across the surface of the Virgin's robe. It is hard to know exactly what he was doing, but it is easy to imagine him watching. That was what apprentices did. They watched, and they ground pigment, and they learned by imitation the grammar of the medium they had entered. And Perugino's grammar was a particular one, graceful, almost languid, with figures that seemed to float rather than stand, with landscapes that receded into soft blues and lavenders, with faces that tilted at gentle angles and expressed a piety that was never harsh, never tortured, but calm and lovely and as predictable as a hymn. Raphael's father had been a painter too, Giovanni Santi, a minor figure in the court of Urbino, but competent and connected enough to have known that his son had a gift. Giovanni died when Raphael was 11, and by then the boy had already spent years in his father's workshop, learning the rudiments of the trade. Urbino was not Florence, but it was not a backwater either. The court of Duke Guidobaldo da Montefeltro was cultivated, intellectual, the kind of place where humanism was not just an idea, but a climate. There were manuscripts, there were conversations about Plato, there was architecture by Bramante's teacher, and there was an atmosphere of measured elegance that would mark everything Raphael would later do. It was a small world, but it was a complete one. By the time Raphael arrived in Perugino's workshop, probably in Perugia, he was already capable. He could draw, he could paint, and he had absorbed from his father's milieu a sense that painting was not just a craft, but an intellectual pursuit, something worthy of a courtly education. But Perugino gave him something else, a manner, a way of arranging space so that everything felt harmonious, balanced, weightless. Perugino's altarpieces were everywhere, churches in Florence, in Rome, in small towns across Umbria. He had a formula, and it worked. His virgins were sweet, his saints were serene, his compositions were symmetrical and clear. And Raphael learned it all. He learned it so well, in fact, that within a few years it became difficult to tell his work from Perugino's. There are paintings from this period, small devotional panels, Madonnas with child, saints standing in soft landscapes, that scholars still argue over. Did Perugino paint this one, or was it Raphael? Or did Raphael start it and Perugino finish it? The boy had not just absorbed the manner. He had disappeared into it. He could replicate Perugino's delicate sfumato, the way the edges of forms dissolved into atmosphere. He could paint the same tilted heads, the same elongated fingers, the same gentle, almost boneless grace. But he was also beginning, quietly, to exceed it. There is something in even the earliest works that can be attributed to Raphael with certainty, a slightly sharper clarity, a slightly more convincing sense of weight, a face that feels just a bit more present, more specific, more alive. One of the first works that seems entirely his own is a small altarpiece painted for a church in Città di Castello, a town not far from Perugia, completed when he was perhaps 17. It shows the Virgin and Child enthroned, surrounded by saints. The composition is Peruginesque symmetrical, calm, the figures arranged in a shallow space, but the faces are more particular, the bodies more solid. The Christ child is not a miniature adult, but a baby, plump and wriggling. The Virgin's face has a sweetness that is not generic, and the landscape in the background, visible through the arched opening behind the throne, has a depth and specificity that suggests someone who had been looking at the world very carefully. He was fast. That was clear almost immediately. Faster than Perugino, faster than almost anyone. He could design a composition and execute it without hesitation, without the labored revisions that marked the work of more tormented temperaments. And this speed was not carelessness, it was a kind of fluency, the way a singer with perfect pitch can find the note without searching. He seemed to know instinctively where things should go, how to balance a figure on one side of a panel with another on the opposite side, how to lead the eye through a composition without forcing it, how to make a group of people look as though they belonged together in space. By the time he was 20, he had his own commissions. He was no longer Perugino's apprentice, but Perugino's rival, though the rivalry was mostly one of influence rather than animosity. Raphael was polite, diplomatic, easy to work with. He did not cultivate the image of the suffering genius. He was professional, reliable, and preternaturally talented. And he was beginning to be known. But Urbino and Perugia were small worlds, and Raphael knew it. If he wanted to see what painting could be, if he wanted to test himself against the best, he needed to go to Florence. He arrived there sometime in 1504, carrying letters of introduction, and what he found was not the calm, predictable grace of Perugino, but something wilder, more ambitious, more strange. Florence was in the middle of a brief, astonishing moment. Leonardo da Vinci had returned to the city after years in Milan, and he was working on a massive mural for the Palazzo Vecchio, a battle scene that would never be finished, but that was already legendary for the preparatory drawings he had made. Horses rearing, men twisted in combat, faces contorted with rage and effort. And Michelangelo Buonarroti, who was younger than Leonardo but already famous, had been commissioned to paint a battle scene on the opposite wall. The two greatest artists in Italy were in direct competition in the same room, and the city was electric with it. Raphael had come from a world where painting was about harmony and grace, where the goal was to soothe and elevate. In Florence, painting was about power, about anatomy, about the human body pushed to its limits. Leonardo's figures were built from the inside out, each muscle and tendon studied and understood. Michelangelo's figures were superhuman, twisting and straining as though the body itself were a battleground. And Raphael, who had been the best painter in his small corner of Umbria, suddenly found himself in a larger conversation, one that demanded more. He began to draw, not just preparatory sketches for paintings, but studies, hundreds of them. Studies of Leonardo's work, of Michelangelo's sculptures, of ancient Roman statuary. He went to see Michelangelo's David, which had been installed in front of the Palazzo Vecchio just a year before, and he drew it from every angle. He studied the way Michelangelo carved contrapposto into marble, the way the weight of the body shifted onto one leg so that the whole figure seemed alive, ready to move. He drew Leonardo's compositions, trying to understand how Leonardo could make a group of figures, say, the Virgin and Child, with Saint and Phil, so effortlessly unified, so organically connected. And then he began to paint Madonnas. This would become his subject, the thing he returned to again and again for the rest of his life. The Virgin and Child, the oldest, most painted subject in Christian art, and the one that seemed to contain, for Raphael, an inexhaustible range of emotional and compositional possibilities. In Florence, between 1504 and 1508, he painted at least a dozen of them, and each one was an experiment. There was the Madonna of the Goldfinch, where the Virgin sits in a meadow, and the Christ child reaches toward the bird held by the young John the Baptist. The figures form a pyramid, a compositional device Raphael borrowed from Leonardo, and the landscape behind them recedes into soft blues. But the gestures are entirely Raphael's, the way the Virgin's hand rests on John's shoulder, protective and tender, the way the Christ child leans forward, curious and unafraid. The painting is small, intimate, meant for private devotion, but it has the monumental clarity of something much larger. There was the Madonna of the Meadow, another pyramidal composition, this time with the Virgin looking down at the two children as they play with a small cross. The Christ child's pose is taken almost directly from a study Raphael made of one of Leonardo's compositions, but the mood is different, less mysterious, more immediate. The Virgin's face is calm but not distant. She is present with the children, absorbed in them, and the viewer is invited into that absorption. And there was La Belle Jardinière, where the Virgin sits in a summer landscape, her body forming a perfect, almost sculptural mass, and the two children press against her with the unself-conscious affection of toddlers. The colors are clear and bright, the forms are solid and convincing, and the whole painting feels as though it were inevitable, as though this were the only way these figures could have been arranged. What Raphael was learning in Florence was how to make grace look effortless while building it on a foundation of rigorous structure. He was learning how to take Leonardo's sfumato and Michelangelo's solidity and combine them into something that was neither mysterious nor overwhelming, but perfectly, luminously clear. He was learning how to make a painting that anyone could look at and understand immediately, and yet that could sustain prolonged looking, that revealed more the longer you stood in front of it. He was also learning how to navigate the world of patronage. Florence was full of wealthy families who wanted paintings, altarpieces for their chapels, portraits for their palaces, devotional panels for their private rooms. Raphael was charming, easy to work with, and he delivered on time. He did not have Leonardo's tendency to leave things unfinished, and he did not have Michelangelo's prickly temperament. He was professional in a way that made him easy to hire and easy to recommend, and so the commissions came. But Florence, for all its energy, was also a republic, fractious and unstable. The great families competed with each other, the political situation was always shifting, and the money, while plentiful, was spread among many hands. Rome, by contrast, was centralizing. Pope Julius II, who had been elected in 1503, was rebuilding the city on a scale not seen since antiquity. He was tearing down the old St. Peter's Basilica and building a new one. He was commissioning frescoes, sculptures, palaces, fountains. He wanted to make Rome not just the spiritual capital of Christendom, but its artistic capital as well, and he was willing to pay for it. Raphael arrived in Rome in 1508, summoned by Julius, though it is not entirely clear how the invitation came about. He was 25 years old, and he had been in Florence for 4 years. He had proved himself capable, but he was not yet famous in the way that Michelangelo or Leonardo were famous. Still, someone, perhaps the architect Bramante, who was from Urbino and may have known Raphael's family, recommended him to the Pope, and Julius, who had a talent for recognizing talent, hired him. The commission was to paint a series of rooms in the Vatican Palace, a suite of chambers that would serve as the Pope's private apartments. These were not small chapels or side altars. These were large, high-ceilinged rooms with walls that needed to be covered entirely in frescoes, and Julius wanted them to rival the Sistine Chapel ceiling, which Michelangelo had just begun painting in the room next door. Raphael began with what is now called the Stanza della Segnatura, the room where the Pope signed documents and held meetings. The walls were divided into 4 sections, each representing a different branch of knowledge, theology, philosophy, poetry, and law. The ceiling was painted with allegorical figures representing these themes, and each wall would contain a large fresco illustrating the theme in a grand narrative way. The first fresco Raphael painted, or at least the first one that is usually discussed first, though the order of execution is debated, was the Disputation of the Holy Sacrament, showing the Church triumphant in heaven and on earth. It is a magnificent composition, crowded with figures arranged in 2 tiers, the upper half showing Christ and the saints in glory, the lower half showing theologians and church fathers gathered around an altar. The figures are clearly articulated, the space is convincing, and the whole painting has a kind of radiant order. But it is not the fresco that would define Raphael's career. That would be the School of Athens. It is difficult, even now, to stand in front of the School of Athens and not feel that you are in the presence of something that should not have been possible. The fresco covers an entire wall, roughly 15 feet high and 25 feet wide, and it depicts a gathering of the greatest philosophers of antiquity inside a vast imaginary hall. The architecture is monumental coffered barrel vaults, soaring arches, massive piers, all rendered in perfect linear perspective so that the space seems to recede infinitely into the distance. And within this space, arranged in groups and clusters across the marble floor, are more than 50 figures, each one individualized, each one engaged in conversation or contemplation or demonstration, each one contributing to the overall sense of a community of thinkers united by their pursuit of knowledge. At the center of the composition, framed by the receding arches, are the two greatest philosophers of antiquity, Plato and Aristotle. Plato, older, bearded, dressed in robes of red and violet, points upward toward the heavens, toward the realm of ideal forms. Aristotle, younger, more solid, dressed in blue and brown, extends his hand outward, palm down, toward the earth, toward the realm of empirical observation. The two gestures summarize the entire history of Western philosophy, the tension between idealism and realism, between the transcendent and the immanent. And Raphael has painted Plato with the face of Leonardo da Vinci. To the left of the central pair, a group of figures clusters around a slate on which a geometrical diagram is being drawn. This is Euclid, or perhaps Archimedes, demonstrating a theorem. The students lean in, attentive, absorbed. To the right, another group gathers around a celestial globe. Further left, a figure sits alone on the steps, head in hand, lost in thought. This is Heraclitus, the philosopher of flux and change, and Raphael has painted him with the face of Michelangelo, a tribute to the artist working in the next room, and perhaps a commentary on Michelangelo's brooding, solitary temperament. In the lower right, a group of astronomers examines instruments. Among them is a figure holding a globe, looking out at the viewer. This is Raphael himself, or at least a portrait of him, inserted into the assembly of geniuses with a modesty that is also a quiet assertion of belonging. He is young, handsome, self-possessed. He is not claiming to be the equal of Plato or Aristotle, but he is claiming a place in the lineage, a role in the transmission of knowledge and beauty. And everywhere, throughout the entire composition, there is a sense of ease, of spaciousness, of clarity. The figures do not crowd each other. Each group is distinct, yet the whole is unified. The eye moves through the composition naturally, led by gestures and glances and the architecture itself, which frames and organizes the scene without dominating it. The light is even, the colors are harmonious, and the overall effect is one of balance, proportion, and grace. It is, in other words, the supreme image of Renaissance humanism, the idea that the wisdom of the ancient world and the truth of the Christian revelation are not opposed, but complementary, that reason and faith can coexist, that the human intellect is capable of understanding the cosmos, and that this understanding is a form of worship. The School of Athens is not just a painting. It is a manifesto, a vision of what the world could be if guided by knowledge and beauty and order. Raphael painted it between 1509 and 1511, working with a team of assistants who helped prepare the walls and fill in the architectural details, but the design is entirely his, and the principal figures were painted by his hand. He was 26 when he began it, 28 when he finished, and by the time it was done, he was no longer just a promising young painter from Urbino. He was one of the most important artists in Europe. The question that arises when you stand in front of the School of Athens, or when you look at any of Raphael's mature work, is whether there is something missing, whether the very perfection of the achievement is also a kind of limitation. Because there is no struggle visible in the painting, no sense of torment, no hint of the tragic, no acknowledgement that the world is anything other than beautiful and comprehensible and good. Compared to Leonardo's enigmatic shadows or Michelangelo's tortured grandeur, Raphael's clarity can seem too easy, too smooth, too free of doubt. This is the tension that would follow Raphael's work for centuries. He was admired, copied, taught in every academy as the model of what painting should be. But he was also, especially in the 19th century, criticized for being too perfect, too classical, too devoid of the inner life that the Romantics valued. The pre-Raphaelites, as their name suggests, defined themselves against him, arguing that painting before Raphael had been more sincere, more spiritually direct, and that Raphael's influence had led art into a dead end of empty technical mastery. But this critique misunderstands what Raphael was doing and what his grace cost. The ease you see in the School of Athens is not the ease of someone for whom everything came naturally. It is the ease of someone who had worked so hard to understand structure, anatomy, perspective, and composition that he could deploy those tools, invisibly, so that the viewer never had to think about them. The grace is not effortless, it is hard-won, and the serenity is not shallow. It is a choice, a way of seeing the world that insists on the possibility of order and beauty, even in a world that was, even then, full of chaos and violence. Julius II was a warrior pope. He led armies, besieged cities, played the great powers of Europe against each other. Raphael was painting these serene visions of philosophical harmony while the Pope was plotting military campaigns. The contrast is almost absurd, but perhaps that is precisely why Julius wanted these paintings. Perhaps he wanted to believe, or to make others believe, that his ambitions were not merely political but cultural, that he was building not just a temporal empire but a renewed Christian civilization, rooted in the wisdom of the ancients. Raphael understood this. He understood that painting was not just about personal expression, but about public meaning, about creating images that could shape how people understood themselves and their world. And so he painted with a clarity that was pedagogical, that invited the viewer in, that made the complex seem simple and the ideal seem attainable. After the stanza della Signatura, there were more rooms to paint. The stanza di Eliodoro, which depicted miracles and divine intervention scenes of popes and emperors protected by God in moments of danger. The stanza dell'Incendio, which celebrated earlier popes named Leo, a compliment to Julius's successor, Leo X, who continued to employ Raphael after Julius died in 1513. And the stanza di Costantino, which showed the conversion of Constantine and the triumph of Christianity over paganism, though this last room was mostly executed by Raphael's assistants after his death. By the time Raphael was working on these later rooms, he was no longer painting every inch himself. He had become the head of the largest workshop in Rome, employing dozens of assistants, many of whom would go on to have significant careers of their own. Raphael would design the compositions, make detailed drawings, and paint the most important figures and faces, while the assistants filled in the backgrounds, the drapery, the architectural details. This was not unusual. Most large-scale projects in the Renaissance were collaborative, but it did mean that the later frescoes have a different quality than the School of Athens, still grand, still impressive, but sometimes less intimate, less entirely his. He was also taking on other commissions. Altarpieces for churches across Rome, portraits of cardinals, bankers, noblewomen, architectural projects, including, after Bramante's death in 1514, the continuation of the design for the new St. Peter's Basilica. He was designing tapestries to hang in the Sistine Chapel, massive cartoons that would be sent to Flanders to be woven. He was studying the ruins of ancient Rome and making measured drawings of them, part of an ambitious project to reconstruct the city as it had been in antiquity. He was writing a letter to the Pope about the need to preserve the ancient monuments, which were being quarried for stone to build the new Rome. He was, in other words, not just a painter, but a cultural figure, a kind of chief visual officer for the papacy, responsible for shaping the image of Rome itself. And through all of this, he kept painting Madonnas. They were smaller now, mostly, than the public frescoes. Private devotional works for patrons who wanted something intimate, something they could live with. But they continued to evolve. The Madonna of the Chair, painted around 1514, is a tondo, a circular composition, and it shows the Virgin holding the Christ child in her lap while the young John the Baptist looks on. The figures fill the circle completely, pressing against the edges, and the composition has a spiraling, turning movement that makes the whole thing feel alive. The Virgin's face is tender, but also weary, as though she knows what is coming. The Christ child clings to her, one arm around her neck, and his face is solemn, not quite a child's face, as though he too understands something of the future. The Sistine Madonna, painted around 1513 or 1514 for a church in Piacenza, is larger, more formal, but it has a quality that none of the earlier Madonnas quite have. The Virgin is walking forward, holding the Christ child, and she seems to be emerging from a cloud of angels, though the angels are barely visible, just faces in the mist. Below her, two saints kneel in adoration, and at the bottom of the composition, two cherubs rest their chins on their hands and gaze upward with an expression that is both knowing and bored, as though they have been watching this scene for eternity. The Virgin's face is heartbreaking. She is beautiful, serene, but there is something in her eyes of sadness, a foreknowledge that makes the painting more than just an image of piety. It is an image of sacrifice, of a mother who knows she is offering her child to suffering. Raphael's Madonnas are sometimes dismissed as too sweet, too perfect, too lacking in the complexity of real human emotion. But that misses what he is doing. He is not trying to paint a real woman. He is trying to paint an ideal, but an ideal that is also emotionally truthful. The sweetness is not saccharine. It is the tenderness of a mother for her child, rendered with a clarity and directness that makes it feel universal. And the sadness, when it appears, is all the more powerful because it is set against that tenderness. Raphael's Madonnas are not interested in the Virgin as a theological abstraction. They are interested in her as a mother, and they find in that relationship a depth of feeling that no amount of technical mastery alone could convey. He was also painting portraits, and these reveal another side of his work. The portrait of Baldassare Castiglione, painted around 1514 or 1515, shows the author of the Book of the Courtier, a treatise on Renaissance manners and ideals. Castiglione sits in three-quarter view, dressed in dark, rich clothing, a fur-trimmed coat and a soft cap, and he looks out at the viewer with an expression that is calm, intelligent, and entirely self-possessed. The painting is almost monochromatic blacks, browns, grays, and the focus is entirely on the face, which is rendered with extraordinary subtlety. The eyes are warm, the mouth is relaxed, and the overall effect is of someone who is both present and reserved, someone who knows how to be in the world without giving too much away. It is one of the great portraits of the Renaissance, and it influenced portraiture for centuries afterward. Rembrandt owned a copy of it, or perhaps a drawing after it, and it is hard not to see its influence in his own self-portraits. The portrait of Leo X with two cardinals, painted around 1518, is more complex, almost a group portrait, though Leo dominates the center of the composition. He sits at a table, a heavy, fleshy man in papal robes, and he is examining an illuminated manuscript with a magnifying glass. The two cardinals stand behind him, one on either side, and they look out at the viewer with expressions that are slightly uneasy, as though they are aware of being watched. The painting is a masterpiece of texture, the sheen of silk, the softness of velvet, the gleam of gold, and it is also a penetrating psychological study. Leo is not idealized. He looks exactly like what he was, a cultivated, worldly man who enjoyed luxury and learning and who happened to be pope. The painting does not flatter, but it does not condemn either. It simply observes with a clarity that is almost ruthless. Raphael was, by the middle of the 1510s, the most successful artist in Rome. He was wealthy, famous, and influential. He lived in a palace designed for him by Bramante. He owned property, he had investments, and he was rumored to be in line for a cardinal's hat, which would have made him not just an artist, but a prince of the church. He was friendly with poets, scholars, and aristocrats. He had a long-term mistress, a woman named Margherita Luti, the daughter of a baker who is said to have been the model for many of his later Madonnas, and for a painting called La Fornena, a portrait of a bare-breasted young woman who looks out at the viewer with a directness that is almost confrontational. He was also exhausted. The demands on his time were immense. The Vatican rooms were still unfinished. The tapestries for the Sistine Chapel required enormous, complex cartoons. The architectural projects for St. Peter's were ongoing, and the private commissions kept coming. He had assistants, but there was only so much he could delegate. And he had always worked fast, too fast perhaps, driven by a need to prove himself or by a temperament that could not slow down. In the spring of 1520, he fell ill. The sources are unclear about what exactly happened. Some say he had a fever, brought on by overwork. Others say he had contracted something from Margherita, though this may just be moralizing gossip. The doctors bled him, which was the standard treatment at the time and which almost certainly made things worse. He died on April 6, 1520, his 37th birthday, or possibly the day after. He had been sick for less than 2 weeks. The whole city mourned. He was buried in the Pantheon, the ancient Roman temple that had been converted into a church, and his tomb was marked with an inscription composed by Pietro Bembo, one of the leading humanists of the age. The inscription said in Latin, "Here lies Raphael, by whom nature herself feared to be outdone while he lived, and when he died, feared that she herself would die." It was, even by the standards of Renaissance hyperbole, an extraordinary claim. But it also captured something true. Raphael had made beauty look natural, inevitable, as though it were not the product of human effort, but a fundamental quality of the world. And when he died, that vision of beauty, that confidence in the possibility of harmony and grace, seemed suddenly fragile. The question of what Raphael's work means, and why it matters, is inseparable from the question of what happened to it after his death. Because Raphael did not just influence the next generation of artists, or the generation after that. He became, for the next 3 centuries, the model, the standard against which all painting was measured. The academies that were founded in the 16th and 17th centuries, first in Italy, then in France, then across Europe taught, drawing and composition through the study of Raphael's works. His paintings were engraved and circulated, and the engravings were studied and copied by artists who would never see the originals. His compositions became the templates for altarpieces, history paintings, and decorative schemes. His Madonnas were endlessly imitated, his frescoes endlessly quoted. This was, in one sense, the highest possible honor, but it was also a kind of trap, both for Raphael's reputation and for the development of art. Because when something becomes a model, it stops being seen as the product of a particular person working in a particular time and place, and it starts being seen as a set of rules, a grammar that can be learned and applied. And the more Raphael's work was codified, the more it was reduced to a set of principles: ideal beauty, clear composition, balanced harmony, the less it was understood as the product of a specific intelligence wrestling with specific problems. By the 18th century, Raphael was so thoroughly enshrined as the ideal that he had become almost boring. He was what you were supposed to admire, and so admiring him became a kind of duty rather than a discovery. And then, in the 19th century, the Romantics and the Realists began to push back. They wanted passion, they wanted individuality, they wanted art that was messy and subjective and alive. And Raphael, with his serene compositions and his idealized figures, seemed like the embodiment of everything they were rejecting. The Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, founded in 1848 by a group of young English artists, took their name from the idea that art before Raphael, before his influence had calcified into academic doctrine, had been more honest, more spiritually direct. They wanted to go back to the clarity and sincerity of early Italian painting, before, as they saw it, Raphael had made everything too smooth, too polished, too perfect. It was not exactly fair. Raphael had not asked to be turned into an academic standard, and the qualities the pre-Raphaels were looking for, emotional intensity, meticulous attention to detail, a sense of spiritual seriousness, were not absent from Raphael's work, but they were not always visible beneath the layers of institutional admiration that had accumulated over the centuries. The 20th century was, if anything, even less kind. Modernism valued disruption, fragmentation, the rejection of traditional beauty. And Raphael, who had spent his life trying to achieve a perfect balance of form and content, who had believed that beauty and clarity were not superficial but profound, was suddenly deeply unfashionable. The avant-garde dismissed him as academic, bourgeois, irrelevant. And even among those who still cared about traditional painting, there was a sense that Raphael was too perfect, too accomplished, that there was nothing to struggle with in his work, nothing to resist. But that assessment, like the pre-Raphaelite critique before it, misses something essential. Because what looks like ease, what looks like perfection, is actually the result of an enormous effort to make complexity look simple, to make structure invisible, to solve problems so completely that the viewer never has to think about them. Raphael's paintings do not announce their own difficulty. They do not insist on their own brilliance. They are generous, inviting, clear. But that clarity is not the absence of depth. It is the achievement of it. And if you look closely, if you spend time with the work rather than with the reputation, you start to see things that the academic tradition and the modernist critique both overlook. You see the way Raphael's figures are not just idealized but individualized, the way each face is specific, each gesture particular. You see the way his compositions are not just balanced, but dynamic, the way the eye is led through the space, not by symmetry, but by rhythm. You see the way his Madonnas are not just beautiful but emotionally complex, the way tenderness and sorrow exist together in a single expression. You see, in other words, that Raphael was not painting according to a set of rules, but inventing a language, and that the language he invented was flexible enough, rich enough, to express a wide range of human experience. There is a painting in the Galleria Borghese in Rome called The Deposition, painted in 1507, early in Raphael's career. It shows the body of Christ being carried to the tomb after the crucifixion. The composition is split into two halves. On the right, a group of men carries the body, their faces strained with effort, their movements awkward and heavy. On the left, a group of women supports the fainting Virgin, who has collapsed at the sight of her son's corpse. The two groups are connected by gesture and glance, and the whole painting is organized around the diagonal line of Christ's body, which stretches from the lower right to the upper left of the composition. It is not Raphael's most famous painting, but it is one of his most ambitious, and it shows him working at the limits of what he knew how to do. The figures are solid, sculptural, influenced by Michelangelo, and the composition is carefully structured, influenced by Leonardo, but there is also something raw in the painting, something unresolved. The grief is not beautified. The Virgin's face is twisted in pain. The men's faces are exhausted, and the whole scene has a weight, a physicality that is far from the serene grace of the later Madonnas. It is a young artist trying to prove he can do what the older masters can do, and the effort shows. And it is all the more moving for that. Raphael's late work, by contrast, has a freedom that suggests someone who no longer needed to prove anything. The Transfiguration, which was left unfinished at his death and completed by his assistants, is split into two zones. The upper half shows Christ transfigured on the mountain, his body radiant, floating between Moses and Elijah, while the apostles below shield their eyes from the light. The lower half shows a crowd gathered around a possessed boy, whom the apostles are unable to heal in Christ's absence. The two halves are connected thematically, the miracle above, the suffering below, but they are visually distinct, almost two separate paintings joined together. The upper half is serene, luminous, classical. The lower half is turbulent, crowded, almost chaotic. And the contrast between them is not a failure of composition, but a deliberate choice, a way of showing that the divine and the human exist in different registers, that grace and suffering are not opposites but parts of the same reality. The painting was displayed at Raphael's funeral, and it is tempting to read it as a kind of summing up, a final statement. But it is not clear that Raphael thought of it that way. He was 37. He had no reason to think he was running out of time, and the painting, for all its ambition, is not a farewell. It is a beginning, an attempt to do something he had not quite done before, and the fact that he did not live to finish it makes it all the more poignant. There is a drawing in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, a study for one of the figures in the School of Athens. It is done in red chalk on cream-colored paper, and it shows a young man in profile, his head tilted slightly downward, his expression thoughtful. The lines are delicate, almost tentative, but they build up into a form that is completely convincing, completely present. You can see the structure of the skull beneath the skin, the weight of the head on the neck, the way the light falls across the face. It is just a drawing, a preparatory study that was never meant to be seen on its own, but it has the same clarity, the same grace as the finished fresco. That grace is what Raphael's work is finally about. Not the absence of difficulty, but the transformation of it. Not the denial of suffering, but the insistence that beauty and order are still possible, still worth striving for. Not the erasure of the self, but the creation of a self that is defined not by torment or isolation, but by connection, by the ability to see and be seen, to participate in a larger conversation. Raphael's world was not serene. It was a world of war, plague, political instability, and religious upheaval. It was a world where artists competed bitterly for commissions, where popes led armies, where the new St. Peter's was being built on the ruins of the old, and where the Protestant Reformation was beginning to fracture Christendom. And in that world, Raphael chose to paint images of harmony, not because he was naive or superficial, but because he believed that art could shape reality, that it could offer a vision of what the world might become. That belief may seem quaint now, or even dangerous. The idea that art should be beautiful, that it should offer consolation and clarity, has been out of fashion for a long time. But Raphael's work persists, and it persists not because it is easy or comfortable, but because it offers something that is always in short supply, a sense of balance, of proportion, of the possibility that human effort can create something lasting and true. The frescoes in the Vatican are still there. The Madonnas are still in museums and churches across Europe. The drawings are still in collections, studied and admired. And the School of Athens is still, more than 500 years after it was painted, the image that comes to mind when people think of the Renaissance, of humanism, of the idea that knowledge and beauty are not opposed but inseparable. Raphael did not live long enough to see what his work would become, or to know that his name would be synonymous with an entire tradition. He died young, at the height of his powers, and the world he left behind was one that he had helped to shape, but that would continue without him. And perhaps that is the final grace of his work. Not that it is perfect, not that it is without struggle, but that it insists, quietly and persistently, that something can be made that outlasts the making, that beauty is not an escape from the world, but a way of being in it, fully, generously, without despair.